Welcome back. Professor Roundtree here again, Chapter 4, Part 2. When we left off in the previous part for market research here, we were talking a little bit about how there are various ways that we could actually collect data. And we were talking about the planning phase when it comes to actually doing primary data collection. Again, primary data collection is where we go out and collect our own information about what's relevant to our brand, our product. Unlike secondary market data, that's data that has already been collected. It's archived data. Someone else has a database that has the information, and we just spend money to gain access to it. So generally, in looking at the primary data collection process, we're going to talk about the various steps here in terms of figuring out the research approach and the different kinds of methods, the sampling plan, and then what kinds of instruments we could actually use. And we're going to kind of take these one at a time. So in terms of research approach, again, primary types of data collection. Two techniques that are very common. They're very common when people are trying to really understand populations by observation or kind of immersing themselves in the population. So for example, if you really wanted to find out how people, if you were Chiquita as a company or Dole Bananas, and you wanted to find out what's the process that people go through when they make their selection of bananas. What do they actually look for? Do they touch it? Do they feel it? Do they smell it? What is the whole process? So you may want to have someone just observe. And we see this a lot in many contexts, even if it's something like a retail setting when it comes to clothing. Looking at how people pick over different sizes and colors, sometimes it gives you some insight into what they're actually looking for and whether they see it when they see your product on the shelf compared to their competitor's product. So observational method, again, just, it's a qualitative kind of technique where you're just looking and observing and taking notes. And so someone with a keen eye to kind of look at unique nuances that people might have in the consumption process is really good. Ethnographic research, typically not as common, but you do get it when it comes to people who are trying to understand certain sub-communities. So for example, if you really wanted to find out how people selected fruit in a very, very small urban grocery store, which many urban grocers have very, very small physical spaces. Maybe the process, because of the crowd and how congested it is, maybe people have a different process when they actually make selection of fresh fruit compared to a large supermarket store that you might see out in the suburban area where it has 30, 40,000 square feet. So a lot of times the ethnographic stuff you really want to do within a community. You could do it and it could be observational. You could do ethnographic research where you interact with them in the way they would normally behave rather than just be an observer. It really depends on the product or service that you're looking at. Generally, you see this, anthropologists do this a lot in the anthropological environment where they go and live with people in certain communities just to kind of see, not from a consumer standpoint, but just see how they react to the environment and see if there are some things that they can observe based on their interaction that they could take and generalize to other populations. Now, that was more qualitative. Survey research is more quantitative. It's the most widely used method. It's one that you can employ and do online. You could do it face-to-face where you record the answers for people. You could send it through the mail. You can talk to them on the phone, ask them the questions, and record it as they give you their answers. It's a very flexible kind of methodology. The problem sometimes that you have with it is that sometimes people give you what they call socially desirable responses. So for example, if you're talking about people and their consumption of, let's say, contraceptives as an example, where people see that there are a lot of privacy concerns, they don't want to be judged, and so they may oftentimes give you an answer or a response to a question, especially if you're face-to-face, where it is what they think you desire from a social standpoint, meaning they don't want to either insult you or they want to basically tell you what they think you want to hear, and they don't want to be judged by you. But survey methodology is still the most widely popular, very cost effective from a statistical standpoint. You just have to make sure that whatever sample you collect has to be representative of the population where you're generally trying to understand. So again, great methodology, very popular methodology, and it will be here forever. Experimental, many of you probably have participated in experiments, maybe as part of your psychology course here at school. But it's really great for trying to understand cause and effect. So for example, you may want to see how people respond to a print ad where you have two different celebrity endorsers in the sample that you have, sample meaning the range. And so you might have, for example, endorser A and endorser B, and you might have a control group. And what you do is you go and you manipulate the spokesperson, and what you're trying to do is to see if that manipulation has any impact on people's favorability toward the product or toward the ad itself. And you could do it for a variety of things. But again, the whole point of experimental research is for gathering causal data or causal information where you can try to determine some cause and effect relationship between variables, either one dependent variable and multiple independent variables. Generally, the dependent variable is what you're trying to measure. So if you're trying to measure satisfaction, it's going to be dependent upon a number of different attributes. And predictability. They use these kinds of predictability studies when it comes to generally trying to predict success, and they do it a lot when it comes to admitting students into undergraduate. But in experimental research design, you're really trying to see some differences or nuances across different manipulations. In the example I gave, manipulations of endorser for a particular product. So here's just some examples in terms of some of the pros and the cons and the different kinds of contact methods when it comes to online, personal, telephone, and mail. Mail is probably the oldest. Well, probably the oldest is personal, and mail is second. Telephone is probably third. The newest one that we have is online. And so if you kind of take a look at some, I'm not going to go through each one of these. I could ask you something like this on an exam. But in terms of flexibility, obviously a mail survey, not flexible at all. Why? Because once you mail it out, either they fill it out or they don't. They can't ask any questions of clarification. Telephone, good interaction because you're actually on the phone, but sometimes there may be some limitations there because you aren't face-to-face, which is why personal is probably the best approach in terms of flexibility. Online is also good too because there you can definitely adjust on the fly. So, for example, even something as simple as, changing the physical composition of the survey based on the device that the person is actually taking the survey on, a tablet versus a desktop computer. The quantity of data collected, personally, I think when we think about the actual quantity in terms of number, I'd probably say online. I would probably flip online and personal. I think online is probably a great way to get good quantity. Now, the question is, how good is the quality? That's going to be the key issue when it comes to online data. Control of the sample, I think that is also good with online, but you have to be very targeted in terms of who you send the link to Qualtrics, SurveyMonkey, whoever you're using, making sure that how you connect with them is going to screen them in as a good participant. The data collection is obviously very speedy with online data collection. Response rate is good, and this is for all of these. You really have to have some kind of incentive for people. Cost is very, very cost effective, and I'm going to quickly contrast that with, let's say, for the personal method. Not very cost effective because you're spending human people's time. Someone has to talk to that person face to face. They have to actually travel to where those people are. Same thing for the telephone, but it's not as bad because you can pretty much talk to people in California online on the phone versus if you were trying to do face to face with people in California and you happen to be in Washington, D.C., it's just a lot more expensive to do. A couple more I'll just go over and then we'll kind of move on. The mail version is really difficult oftentimes to do with surveys through the mail. You have to give an incentive up front. Many of you probably have received this where you get $1 or $2 in an envelope, and what they're really trying to do there is to kind of play on our guilt. So if they send us money up front, I think what they believe is that we feel obligated to actually send back the survey completed. Can be very cost effective, although the price of mailing stuff out is going up almost exponentially compared to, let's say, the cost of actually administering surveys online. So again, the key point here is to really kind of contrast and compare some of these different methods to collect data. Online is growing in that it is probably an easy way to connect with a very large sample of people, and also too, people are used to using the web to do a variety of things. Telephone, it's tough to catch them. So here, I mean, the issue is online, it's just more flexible. It gets them to do or participate on their own time and at their own speed. Focus groups, another method you can use. Again, all these methods that are more qualitative, interviewing on the phone or interviewing face-to-face, and of course focus groups, these are all what we would call qualitative types of methodologies. And they're all really good, and they should be a precursor. They should come before you do the quantitative surveying, because a lot of times you get some really good insights that will help you in figuring out what questions you should be asking. Typically, it's a group of 6 to 10 people. A moderator, it makes all the difference in the world. A really good moderator could make a focus group go very well. A poorly trained moderator, or just someone who just doesn't do a good job at moderating, could make it more challenging. I mean, it's very expensive to pay moderators. They make a great deal of money. If you ever want to make an awful lot of money, if you're really good at essentially leading group discussion, a moderator is usually a person who at the end of the day, it almost feels conversational with the group, and it doesn't really feel like he or she's actually there. But it's very expensive to do. It's very difficult to generalize from these 6 people or so. I mean, so you kind of take it with a grain of salt, and there you might say it might make sense then to use this information that we get to create a template for one-on-one depth interviews, possibly. And then you get on to the survey stuff. Also, too, a good selection process is going to be really important. Who do you opt into your focus groups? Sometimes you run the risk of having a group that's too divergent, and you have the opinions that are too diverse and divergent. So sometimes it's really about having smaller groups. So for example, you can have older people, and their response to a particular product or brand may be very different from teenagers. So you don't want to mix the two groups up, because it just may not work for a free-flowing information opportunity for you. So if let's say, for example, we decided to do research online, there are a variety of things you could do. You could do surveys, and those are really easy to do. Online experiments, those are easy to do and manipulate. Again, the key here is getting qualified people who you want to actually participate in this. They do online focus groups, and in a lot of ways, it's one great big chat. It's kind of like a Google Hangout, where you have a small group of people, maybe, like we said before, 6 to 10 people. Again, you still have some of the nuances and difficulties in interacting with people online. Personally, I think it's a lot better than trying to do it in more of a chat format, because you don't get body language that you can see. You see a lot of body language when you have them sit in a conference room. Even online in a chat format like a Google Hangout, you still don't get the full range of what's actually going on in terms of the dynamics if you're having them interact, especially with a physical product. And also too, they have online panels which are really where people kind of chronicle a diary. You may want to, for example, follow someone as they are searching online for, let's say, a new pair of shoes, and you would pretty much track. You can do it with software. You can track them to kind of see what kinds of information they look for, how long it actually takes them to make a decision. Do they change their mind? Do they abandon the cart? All sorts of information you can track, and that's really helpful because the internet gives you a lot of opportunities to really kind of track people in terms of time. You don't really get emotion from it, but you do get issues related to time and selection and things of that nature. And some of the advantages, definitely low cost compared to some of the other ways. You can get a high response rate, but again, high response rate, it has to be good quality stuff. It's really good for reaching people who it's very difficult to reach. So for example, if it's very difficult to get people, especially if you live in one region, but you want a sample that's representative in a focus group who live in California or who live in Asia, who live in some European country, it's a great cost-effective way to get to folks who are hard to reach. And also too, you collected data very quickly, actually. So speed is always important too. So how do you figure out what the sample is? A sample, again, should be a statistically selected group of people that should represent the population you're trying to study. So in theory, if you select the proper sample, you can take the results you get from that sample and what they call extrapolate it to the general population. So you really, one, have to know who you're studying. And then you should try to figure out statistically, how many people do you need to study where you can generalize to the population. And there are many ways to figure out how to choose them. And there are companies that will actually do it too, where they have access to sometimes panels of people who are good at responding to, for example, automobiles and certain categories. And so the important thing is whatever sample you're going to select, please make sure it's statistically relevant and it makes sense for the population you're trying to get general information about. Now, you may remember from statistics, there are probability samples and then there are non-probability samples. Many times, if you're really trying to generalize to an entire population, it really should be a probability sample where every person in the population has an equal chance of selection. Now, for most of us, that's not going to ever be the case because we don't even know the universe of people who are in the population. Sometimes, many researchers, it will be a non-probability sample where they're just selecting someone, based on some sort of judgment, where they make some inferences. So people who are living in DC are representative of people who live in the Mid-Atlantic region. And then you can assume that Mid-Atlantic region is representative of the entire East Coast. Generally, you want to try to have a probability sample, but sometimes it's just not possible to do. It depends on the product, it depends on the service, it depends on the questions you're looking to have answers to. So for example, if you want to find out what students in the Washington, D.C. area, college students think about a particular brand or product, the population of students who are here, that's something you can pretty much nail down, actually. We know the number of schools and where they're located. We even know something about the number of students who were enrolled. We could figure out a way to do that. If you're trying to talk to people who watch video games and you want to generalize it to the entire world or globe, you just can't get sampling many times from different parts of the region to make it statistically valid. So the most common research instrument when we talk about doing surveys is probably going to be a questionnaire. Like we said in one of the previous slides where we were going through the pros and the cons, it could be administered through person, by phone, online. It's a very flexible type of methodology. But one of the things that you really need to do, and that's where the qualitative work comes in, the focus groups, the in-depth interviews, where you're really trying to wordsmith and come up with the right words and the right order for questions where it really makes sense for that population. So that's why generally qualitative research like focus groups and depth interviews, that typically will precede quantitatively based research methods, which are surveys where we have a bunch of questionnaires. And so the questions could be of many types. You could have very closed-ended questions where you pretty much know the choices that you're looking for them to select from. Many times you may want to have some open-ended questions because you're kind of exploring. You don't really know what it is that they're going to say. And so what you wind up doing is asking them free form to write, like an essay. And so a lot of times you get more things related to behaviors as well as feelings versus closed-ended questions. There's no room for interpretation or expansion. It's just pick one. It's just like multiple choice questions on exams versus essays. Now, some of the more common techniques that are used now in terms of collecting data, for example, scanner data, very, very popular to this day for retailers as well as manufacturers to gain some insight in terms of what we buy, the quantities that we buy in, what other products do we buy to complement or supplement, where we generally live geographically, and is that any different from other parts of the country. So a lot of this check out the scanner data is very, very important and very critical to really understanding what consumers are doing and how and why and where. We also have some other instruments or tools, and a lot of these are based in technology of some sort. We have mechanical devices like I think Time Warner has a lab where they really try to get at and test what it is that we actually watch when we watch TV and how we actually react. Kind of couple that with some of the neuroscience applications to marketing where they try to get people's physiological reactions to certain brands, and so they're really trying to kind of look at it more from the standpoint of a holistic, how do we understand how consumers respond and what they respond to. I mean, the oldest one that's been used is the Nielsen meters that they've had on boxes for the longest time. This is even before satellite dish and the like, to try to gauge what we are actually watching, and then crossing that with the old-fashioned diary where you write down who's in attendance for watching a TV program. To this day, they still use some form of that, where they use a combination of written documentation like a diary and then also to information that's captured. Now, one of the beauties, I believe, in terms of looking at what's going on today, where people are kind of moving toward watching TV programs through Netflix and Hulu Plus and some of the others, where they're essentially watching TV online. And again, like I had mentioned earlier, a lot easier to collect data when it's online. But again, you have some privacy concern issues as well. So kind of wrapping this up here, trying to get through the next few slides here. We're probably going to go for about another 3-4 minutes. So hang in there. In terms of implementing a research plan, we need to collect the information, we need to process it. Again, if it's done online, it just makes it a lot easier. Analyzing the information, you have to figure out how you're going to analyze it. If you're trying to do some predictive kinds of analysis, maybe having a regression model of some sort or a logit model that's more of a predictive model. But the important thing here is just getting to the point where you can interpret what the findings are and make some conclusions, draw conclusions, and give the report to people who are actually going to use the information for decision making. Again, reducing the risk in decision making. And we talked about, I believe, in Chapter 1, this whole thing of customer relationship management. Again, we were contrasting people building relationships versus transaction-oriented kinds of companies. Most of this data that we're seeing with marketing information is a great way to build relationships. That's why every time you buy something from Amazon, that's another point of data that helps them understand what your likes and dislikes are. And so they can send you better recommendations. The more data they have about us, I know the privacy issue is always an issue, but the more data they have, data points they have about us, and touch points, as they would call them generally, the more information they can take, where they can better predict, for example, serving up ads that are for relevant products or services, or making recommendations for a new book that you might want to purchase. And here are just some examples of some customer touch points that you would have. Purchases, obviously, interactions with salespeople, service calls, websites, postings that we do in satisfaction, reviews. Every time you buy a movie on Amazon or you rent a movie on Amazon, they will send you basically, a survey to help you, to have you respond to say how you enjoyed that particular program that you watched. Again, all points of data, because this will all go back to helping them build a customized experience for you, and hopefully, in theory, build a relationship with the organization. So once you gather all this information, it's like, what the heck do you do with it? A lot of times the information is really there for internal usage for the employees, other stakeholders. They could be partners. So if it's information related to logistics, maybe you might want to share it with your logistics partner, FedEx, UPS, or whoever it might be. But oftentimes it's really there for the purposes of managing that particular brand or groups of brands. They may also share it also too if we're talking about let's say information related to supplies. Let me give you an example. I bought a printer and every time I actually run low, the information is sent to Hewlett-Packard. Hewlett-Packard probably then sends information that feeds into their system that looks at how much demand they have for the toner refills for their particular cartridges for the brands that I purchased, or the models that I purchased, or somebody else has purchased. So the information can be used for a lot of different reasons, a lot of different purposes. But again, at the end of the day, it's all about providing a great experience to the customer, hopefully. And so finally, a couple of points here. Market research is great for any company. Obviously, market research organizations are good for small businesses and nonprofits. But again, they all balance it with cost. So sometimes the information might cost you more money than it can be used to generate revenue. If you're an international company, the ante goes up in terms of really trying to understand who these customers are and how they might be different. So then you have to sort of like interlock issues of culture and how they might respond, for example, to surveys. You just can't convert it to French. You have to make sure that it's sensitive to the culture in order for you to get good and useful information that will be helpful to running your business and reducing any kind of risk in decisions you're going to make. And then finally, it's the privacy issue. It's always going to be here as a question. The key point is you don't want to misuse the research findings, the data you collect. So the more transparent you can be, I think the better off you will be in the long run, because people are not going to think that you're trying to take advantage of them. Anyway, that's the end of the market research segment. That's chapter 4. And I will see you on the other side when we talk about chapter 5.
That was easy.